unmarried mothers are now the new normal among young women in the United States. But why is the U.S. so difficult for single mothers compared to other similarly industrialized nations? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Kimberly Halkett. 6 out of 10 women who give birth in their early 20s in the United States are unmarried. That's according to a Census Bureau report out this month, which also found that across all ages, single motherhood has increased 80% since 1980. Well, the intervening years have also seen an increase in the social acceptance of single parenthood. There are still big divides when it comes to race and education. The rate of unmarried mothers is much higher among African Americans and Native Americans compared to whites or Asians. And the unmarried birth rate goes down the more educational opportunities a woman has. A report released last year by Legal Momentum, a women's legal defense and education fund, found that single mothers in the U.S. have the highest employment rate compared to other industrialized nations, but they also have the lowest wages. And unlike other industrialized countries, single mothers in the U.S. have little help from the government. Head Start is among the few public programs which provides educational and social services to low-income families. But as the director of Head Start, Yvette Sanchez-Fuentes, told us, it serves only a small number of those in need.
Our mission is to serve the neediest and the poorest kids in communities. Whether it's a single mom or whether it's an extended family, living with aunts or uncles, it's important for moms, I think moms in general, but especially single moms, to have a safe place where they can leave their kids so they can go to work, so that they can go to school. It's important to make sure that families have choices, that single moms have choices about where they can leave their kids and feel good about it. You've got some states who are doing some really innovative things, like Oklahoma, and thinking about how do we provide more choice. You have programs like Head Start that only serve about 1 million kids. And then we have childcare programs across this country that all vary. Some are really high quality, some are really low. And sometimes it's just there's not enough choice.
Well, joining us for more from New York, we have Laurie Maldonado, co-author of the report Worst Off: Single-Parent Families in the United States. We also have in our studio Sarah Jane Glynn. She is a sociologist and associate director of the Women's Economic Policy Program at Center for American Progress. We're also joined by Philip Cohen, sociology professor at the University of Maryland. He also runs a blog called Family Inequality. Ms. Maldonado, I'd like to start with you. We heard about the challenges there of child care for single parents, but you recently authored or co-authored a report that found that single moms fare worse in the United States than any other industrialized country in the world. Talk to us a little bit about some of the factors that differentiate a U.S. mom or U.S. parent compared to other nations.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I co-authored a report with Tim Casey from Legal Momentum, and it compared the U.S. to 16 other countries. And the main finding was, on all accounts, U.S. single parents were doing much worse. So this is when you account for child care and how they're doing on poverty and working in the low wage market and all these things. It's I guess we would really describe it, and this is coined from Greg Kaufman, as it's really the perfect storm for single parents. That because our system is in the United States is so stingy, it's like the lack of it, they really fall through the cracks, and it really contributes to the dire circumstances of their lives.
Let's talk a little bit about some of those factors, because you touched on poverty. We've talked about the child care issue there. Let's isolate one of those. For example, we know that this group has the highest rate of employment, but also the lowest wages. Why is that a problem?
In U.S., 50%, so half of children in single-parent families are poor. So that's enormous amount. And if all the countries on average, it's like 26%. And if you were to talk about Denmark, it's 8%. So the poverty rates are exceptionally high in the U.S. And then you look at the other thing that we found in the report, and the employment rates of single parents in the United States are the highest. So you have single parents working really, really hard, and they're actually working in longer hours, and they have a higher rate of full-time over part-time employment as compared to the other countries. And so the question is, well, if they're working so hard, why are the poverty rates so high? And that is really about the low-wage job market. And so in the United States, 40% of single moms work in the low-wage job market. And so that's pretty big, because in the United States, generally speaking, about a quarter of Americans are in the low-wage job market. And so you can imagine, if you're making $11 an hour, $22,000 a year, that's hard to get by as a single mom, And then if you compile that with, the lack of family policies, or, the lack of taking time off to go care for your child, or kind of trying to balance these things, it makes it really, really hard for single parents to do, and all families to do, actually.
Well, I want to get to our studio guest, because I see you nodding here in agreement with just about everything that Laurie Maldonado is saying. Sarah Jane Glynn, talk to me a little bit about some of the points that were raised by your colleague. For example, how does a lack of quality childcare, or even quality health care, and the parents are working these long hours, she described it as a perfect storm. I mean, why does it put children and these families at risk?
Well, child care is wildly expensive in the United States, and the waiting lists to get subsidized care are extremely long in most states. So we know that for single moms who are paying for child care, meaning they don't have a family member who can provide that care for free, they end up spending about a quarter of their wages just to provide child care for their kids. So that's a quarter of their take-home pay that they're then paying to the babysitter who's watching their children. And if you look at families that are below the poverty line, it's 40% of a mother's wages that are going towards child care. That's eating up an enormous chunk of families' budgets, and it makes it really difficult, for families to get by. But having quality, stable childcare is incredibly important for employment, because if you don't know that your child is in a safe environment and that somebody's there taking care of them, there's no way that you can hold down a job.
But I think one thing that a lot of people don't realize is that when you have childcare, that doesn't mean you have care when your child is sick, is it? Mm-hmm. That's another complicating factor. There are such broad ranges of childcare in the United States. Maybe, Philip Cohen, you can talk about this a little bit, because that's one of the issues. Many childcare facilities simply will not take a child that's ill because the other children are at risk of being exposed. I mean, how would, for example, having paid sick days in the United States, something that other industrialized nations have, but that the United States really doesn't have for the most part, how would something like that make a difference in the lives of single parent families?
Well, the deficits that single mothers have are money and time, and if you can't afford high quality child care, and very few people can, and you don't have time because you're working at a low wage job which isn't flexible and doesn't permit time off and can fire you for missing a day of work, then the complications add up. I mean, I think what we see here is there's a general failure to fill the gap of care for children when there's the family resources are not enough. We have sort of a family-based system of care, and for a large sector of our families, the family can't provide enough. So what we have to do is find ways to fill that gap. Something like sick leave for families, child care, health care. These are all ways that we can bring resources to bear on children who need them.
Ms. Maldonado, I want to ask you, though, I mean, these problems that we're talking about, I mean, the fact of working mothers, it's nothing new. The numbers are growing and have been growing steadily. Why is it, though, that policies to maybe improve the lives of children and families in these situations has lagged so far behind?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's a hard one to answer, because if you look at all these other countries, they just have robust, early childhood education. They have robust family policies, just on all accounts. And in the United States, we kind of are exceptional in some ways, and we favor the market. Over some of these security things, which is fine. But if you kind of look in our history and the progressive era and the New Deal, we did have some really great progressive things like this. And so it really wasn't until the 1980s that our social policy kind of took a turn to the rightward. So I guess I'm very optimistic in our U.S. history that we actually can adopt these policies, and especially the family policies. I mean, just to go back to that, this idea of, in the United States, we're the only country, except for 4 other countries in the world, that doesn't have paid maternity leave. So yes, we have unpaid through the Family Medical Leave Act, but single parents aren't accessing this. And either they don't qualify or it's too difficult for them to take time without pay. So, these idea of family policies, maternity leave, paternity leave, enhancing this in the United States is, I think, is definitely feasible and should be on the agenda.
Philip Cohen, President Obama did propose in his most recent speech and budget preschool for all initiative in the 2014 budget. This is something that would at least be perhaps a step in the right direction, or no? I mean, this is something that would expand at least preschool for all children in the United States, and it would be for free. I mean, is this one attempt to try and start shifting the policy in the right direction?
I think so. One of the great insights from some European social welfare programs is that when the program is universal, it's popular. If the program is for the poor, then middle class and rich people are going to resent it. If everybody had it, I think they would get over the tax increase that implied pretty soon, and they'd be demanding that it be protected, just like Social Security and Medicare. So universal, the universal aspect of it could be very important, and also it has a potential to be very equalizing. I mean, one of the things, besides just children's well-being, that we see at risk when people don't have adequate childcare is also the spreading inequality between rich and poor children. So if you could bring up that floor a little and equalize the care, then you could stop punishing children for having poor parents.
But this isn't a done deal, is it? I mean, we're dealing with a Congress that has trouble passing just about anything. I mean, what's the likelihood? We've been talking about decades of this issue compounding and the policy lagging behind. Maybe Sarah Jane Glynn, you could talk to us a little bit about whether there really is the political will in the U.S. Congress and the United States as a whole to see something like that really come into play.
Well, we haven't seen a lot of movement of these types of bills and legislation, unfortunately. But there is starting to be, a lot of grassroots movement around this. People on the ground are saying, we need this. This impacts our family. And we're also starting to see, coming out of cities and states that have implemented programs to help people manage their work responsibilities with their family lives, we're starting to see evidence that not only is it not bad for business, it's actually good for business. So San Francisco was one of the first cities to implement a paid sick days law that guaranteed workers the right to earn paid sick days. And people were terrified that the sky was going to fall once this passed. And what they actually found was that afterwards, San Francisco had greater growth than the surrounding counties. And the surrounding counties didn't have these business mandates in place.
But we're in this climate right now of cost cutting, sequestration. Isn't there going to be the argument that the United States simply can't afford a program like this?
I would argue we can't afford not to do these things. I mean, work supports like this are what allow people to stay employed. And in this economy, it's incredibly important when you have a job to be able to keep it. And so anything that we can do to help people stay in their jobs is good for those individual workers and their families' economic security, but it's also good for the businesses that are employing them. It's tremendously expensive to replace a worker. It costs about 20% of that worker's salary to have to recruit and train a new person to take their place. The types of policies that we're talking about would cost far less than that to implement. So it's really a win-win situation. It's just a matter of getting the facts out there so people understand what we're really talking about.
I want to talk and look at another piece of legislation that was passed in the U.S. House this week. The U.S. House of Representatives this week passed the Working Families Flexibility Act. Now, this bill allows private sector employees to choose between compensatory time off and cash payment for overtime work. The Republican majority in the House says workers will get to spend more time with their families. Democrats and labor unions say that employers will be able to pressure workers into taking compensatory time off instead of overtime pay. They also argue that such a measure gives employers the incentive to substitute paid leave with a system in which workers earn their time off by working overtime. The White House, though, has said it's going to veto any such legislation, and it's unlikely to be passed by the Democratic majority Senate. Laurie Maldonado, I want to get your reaction to this. I mean, is this something that would be useful? The White House is saying, no, we're going to veto this if it comes to the president's desk.
Well, anytime you can improve the flexibility of the work environment, it's going to help single parents. It just is, because then they're not going to have to make a decision of like, my child's sick, I don't know what to do, I can't go to work, I'm going to lose my job. They'll have the flex time to take it.
Sarah, what's your thought?
Well, I think it's true that greater flexibility is really important for all workers, not just single parents. The problem is that this particular legislation wouldn't actually be offering greater flexibility to workers. It would be helping employers to save money down the line. There's nothing in this legislation that actually guarantees workers can take this leave when they need to. Half of single working moms don't have a single paid sick day. And part of this legislation says, if you go to your boss and say, I want to use my comp time because the school just called me, my child is very ill, I need to leave now to pick them up. Your boss can say, you didn't give me enough warning, no. And you can end up losing your job, right? And not being able to tap into this system that's supposed to be in place to help you. So, I mean, the name of this legislation is fantastic. Everybody loves workplace flexibility, but unfortunately, that's not what it's really going to offer.
And these are challenges that, we've been talking predominantly about single parents who are in the lower income brackets, but these are challenges faced by many single parents in middle income brackets as well. I want to play the story of one woman that we spoke to who is a single parent. She is middle income. Here's what she had to say.
My name is Amy Nephal, and I live in Washington, D.C., where I'm raising my daughter, Cora, and I work at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services as a public health policy analyst. My husband, Chris Felix, died in 2001, and at that time we were trying to have a baby together using in vitro fertilization. And so when he died, I had frozen embryos in the freezer, and I knew immediately that I wanted to finish what we had started, and Cora was born 19 months after he died. I was able to stay out of work for 5.5 months and then put her into the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and Department of Education child care when she was an infant, and it was across the street, so I could go across on my breaks in the beginning and I could nurse her and spend some time with her. I have been sort of horrified when I've heard women who've had to go back to work after 8 weeks home on maternity leave, or even 3 months. You're just kind of getting your feet on the ground. Your kid is just starting to have a regular sleep pattern.
You can just sleep.
I'm paid well for what I do. That affords me a tremendous amount of flexibility. If I were in a job that required me to be there to punch in and punch out, where I didn't have any sick leave, where I didn't have health benefits, that would be devastating. I don't know how people can do that. One of the hardest things that I face as Cora's only parent is when I'm sick. It's the Achilles heel of parenthood. When I'm unable to take care of her and when I have to really call on other people, that makes me feel really vulnerable, and it's really hard. There's an assumption in the workplace that there are two people at home, and that somehow there's flexibility. I think there's a lot of chauvinism still in the workplace, and a lack of recognition that there may only be one person that can be home taking care of a kid. The schools are out of sync with what a work schedule is supposed to require, and work schedules are out of sync with what school schedules are. And I think unless there's a shift, unless there's a recognition that families need more time at the beginning of a child's life, I'm not sure how we would change that.
Philip Cohen, I'll get you to respond to that story. Ms. Neville's story there is not typical of sort of the average single parent that we're talking about here, but still she expresses some of the challenges. Your reaction?
Well, I admire someone who can pull that off. You have to, you see the resources coming from all different angles, and the question is, how are we going to bring them to bear to help a woman in her situation? You have the employer, you have the government, you have herself, and her social network, her family, and if any one of those pieces is missing, we don't have an adequate protection to make sure that people aren't falling too far down.
So, Ms. Glynn, how does the U.S. failure to kind of help all single-parent families, no matter what the income bracket might be, how does this put the nation at risk? And why is there not a recognition of that?
Well, I mean, if you look at the unemployment numbers, I think it tells a pretty striking story. Single moms are twice as likely to be out of work but looking for a job as single moms. And part of that is because when these conflicts arise, people end up either having to leave work and quit their jobs, or they end up getting fired. And that's not good for anybody. It's not good for our economy, and it's not good for families. I mean, what we need to be doing is helping people find good jobs and stay in those jobs so that they can build up their resumes, build up their experience, and contribute back. The longer that you're in a job, the more you learn and are able to contribute to not just your employer, but also the economy as a whole. And that's something that we should be fostering, as opposed to, getting people into these low-wage, low-skilled jobs where they're shifting from one employer to another, never advancing. I mean, nobody benefits from that.
But that seems like it's sort of the micro level. Is there something that needs to be done kind of at the broader level, too, in terms of getting the message to the policymakers that there actually needs to be an investment in children and it benefits the entire nation? I mean, there doesn't seem to be a recognition of that.
Well, and that's something that at the Center for American Progress we're really working on right now, is trying to get together all of this research that we have to show this is good not only for families and not only for their individual budgets, but also good for our larger economy. It will help in terms of building our middle class. It helps America be more competitive, and it helps us in terms of our economic growth.
So, Philip Cohen, did you have something to say there?
No, go ahead.
Okay, Ms. Maldonado, I want to ask you then. I mean, if this is sort of, it seems we're all in agreement here about what the problems are, but what needs to be done? I mean, what is the most urgent and critical step based on the research that you've done?
I think there's really three things, and one is increasing transfers. So, this happened across all the other countries is, they did taxes and they did transfers to the single parent families, and it just greatly reduced poverty. It was really effective strategy. So it's kind of a very simple solution. I don't know if
I fully understand the transfers. I mean, what do you mean by that? I'm not sure. Is that sort of a particular term in your industry?
Yeah. Thank you so much. In the United States, that really is like the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit. So it's basically like helping out another, a family. They pay less in taxes or they get a tax refund. So more of that really, really works. So that's what we've seen work in sort of, these other high-income countries, particularly the Nordic
What about, too, though, something like the minimum wage? I mean, that seems like a really good place to start. Okay.
Number two is the low-wage job market. Definitely we need a living wage. So, we need to have more of the collective bargaining and rights, workers' rights that really help. Considering 40% of single parents are in low-wage jobs, we really need to kind of upshore that. And they also, in these other countries, they have these things called active labor market policies. So it's not just putting somebody in a low-wage job, but giving them the skills to advance. And this helps, the economy in all ways. So we really need to apply more of those strategies in regarding the labor market. And then I guess, really the third thing, which it's just family policies. It's paid leave. It's providing the flexible work environment. And I would really argue that all of those things benefit all families. It's what Philip Cohen was talking about. It's the universal strategy, but it really, really helps single parents.
I see you both nodding here in our studio, but as a congressional reporter, I have to say I don't see the political will on Capitol Hill, especially in the Republican-dominated lower House of Representatives, to manifest any of these things that we're talking about here.
Well, if you can demonstrate a specific benefit from a specific policy, you have a fighting chance to at least make the case. Now, obviously, I don't think you're going to move the current Congress very far. But, for example, when it comes to universal early childhood education, the evidence is so strong that the return on investment is good, that the benefit is shared not just by the families and the individual children, but it's also can be portrayed to the public as a matter of fairness, as a matter of equal opportunity. We have a very strong tendency to worry about the single motherhood problem as a problem of the number of single mothers rather than their well-being and their children's well-being.
But why is this a largely academic argument? Why are we not seeing more outrage? If this is cutting across all income lines and it's affecting so many people, why are we not seeing people in the streets in front of the U.S. Congress demanding something better?
Well, I think for a long time, people have understood these as their own personal, private troubles. And so this is something that's happening within my home, and I have to find a way to deal with it on my own. But what we're starting to see now is that people are understanding this isn't just an individual issue, this is a societal issue. And so I'm really hopeful that we're going to see people banding together and understanding this is a public issue that needs to be dealt with at the national level. This isn't something that we should just expect people to be dealing with on their own, because frankly, it's too much for any one person to be able to solve all by themselves.
Philip Cohen, do you think that's the reason? And do you see a transition from the the academic argument to something broader?
Well, there is definitely a tendency to view people's poor situation as a result of their own actions, and that's pretty deep in our culture. So to get out of that really requires an effort to tell stories like you did today. I mean, I think if people can get a sense that people's well-being is not just from their own individual decisions. One way to think about it is, if somebody has low skills or has ended up in a difficult situation, you may expect them to be near the bottom of the social order, but how low should that bottom be? And that's sort of it requires an active imagination on our part to say, well, you know what, of course, if you don't have a college degree or engineering skills or a lot of experience, we're not expecting you to be the highest paid person and your children to get into the most expensive schools. But should you be starving and homeless? Well, most people don't think so. So we can have that conversation like we do with the living wage argument.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining us and bringing your perspectives. Thank you for coming to Inside Story Americas. That is all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now. Thanks for watching Inside Story Americas.